And we just want to welcome everybody to this cost feasible plan virtual public meeting for the Volusia Flagler 2050 Long Range Transportation Plan. We are recording the meeting, and this will be posted and available on demand afterwards. So if someone you're aware of who's interested in seeing this, or if you wish to review any of the information, again, it will be available on the TPO's website after this meeting today. Now we've put into the chat a link to the primary document that we're going to be talking about, the cost feasible plan draft. That is also available on the TPO's website. So if you don't have a way to go to the chat, you can just go to the website and then choose the section for planning and studies, and then go straight to the Volusia Flagler 2050 page, and that same document will be linked there. And a little bit we'll also be providing a link to the public coordinate map. That is one of the ways in which we're going to take in comments for this process. So, but thank you again for joining. Mike, go ahead and go to the next slide. We're going to do some introductions in just one moment, but what we're primarily going to be covering today is where we've been so far with this long-range plan, some of the things that we've accomplished already, and then we're going to talk principally about the draft cost feasible plan, and we'll kind of position that for those who aren't familiar with what that is. We'll give some background on exactly what its importance is to the TPO and to the region's transportation planning. We'll have some time for questions and comments, and then look ahead to some things that are forthcoming. So we appreciate you being here. And Mike, go ahead to the next slide. So Colleen, if you want to introduce.
Yes, thank you. And welcome everyone. I'm glad you could join us this afternoon. My name is Colleen Nicklin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Volusia Flagler Transportation Planning Organization, or the TPO. I'm so glad to have you here today. We've had a series of workshops, throughout the development of the plan. So those of you that have joined us in the past, thank you. And those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. As we move through the presentation today, we're going to be talking about our draft cost feasible plan from our long range transportation plan. And it's important to note that this is a very important document for the TPO because it provides the framework to guide multimodal transportation investments within our community. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jim, and he'll introduce the consulting team and lead us through the workshop.
Okay, great. Thank you, Colleen. And I'm Jim Wood. I'm the project manager for service to the TPO on this project. I'm with Kimley Horn, and then joining me on screen here is Mike.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Mike Votto, planner with Kimley Horn. Happy you're here with us. Thanks.
And then we also have Sabrina Viteri, who's been key support to us on this process. She's also online here. So we thank you all for joining us. And Mike, let's go ahead and proceed to the next slide. So how to provide feedback. Please feel free to ask questions at any time that we're presenting. We're going to have a couple of points where we'll pause and specifically ask if you either have questions, or at the end we will go through some questions that we want you to be thinking about and give us some response on. But at any time, if you have a question about something, please feel free to either raise your hand so that you can verbally ask the question, or you can submit that through the chat function. And we will try to monitor those and respond to those in the context of that part of the meeting. Comments are being received. This is part of a public comment process on this draft cost feasible plan. And so there's a 30-day review period, which has begun already, and it will end on August 1st. So after this meeting today, you still have through the end of July and to the first day of August to provide comments, either via email or on the website for the TPO. There is a location where you can put your comments in on the long range plan webpage. And then also we have a public input map that we'll talk a little bit more about. Some of you may have already used it if you've been involved with these meetings in this process before. So Mike, if you could proceed to the next. So this is a major product of the Volusia Flagler TPO, and we're giving you a little bit of background. And some of you may be familiar with this, and if you've attended other workshops, virtual workshops, you're going to hear some things that you've heard before, but we just want to be sure to have everybody on the same page in terms of what we're doing. But the TPO is a federally designated agency responsible for planning and programming transportation funds. And so when a particular urban area reaches a population threshold, it will become designated as a TPO. And Volusia Flagler, previously the River to Sea TPO, has been in place for some time. But obviously there's several of these all throughout Florida. In fact, there's 27 of these same organizations across the region in Florida. And this TPO now includes all of Flagler and Volusia counties. Historically included Volusia and then parts of Flagler, but with the 2020 census and change in some of the urban areas and just an overall process that's open to evaluate TPO boundaries, it was determined at that point, not too long ago, to incorporate all of Flagler County. So the TPO includes both Flagler and Volusia. Key activities are this document we're talking about today, which we'll say a little bit about more in a moment. But then another item that's done annually is the list of priority projects, and this is the top priority unfunded projects. And so this cost feasible plan feeds into that list of priority projects, and then ultimately projects are selected from that list of priority projects to become part of the Transportation Improvement Program, that third bullet there. That's the 5-year program of projects that are actually moving through and different phases and segments being funded. So this is all part of teeing up the big picture for the long range plan and moving through those. And then the Unified Planning Work Program is just another kind of administrative key document that the MPO creates to monitor and kind of show the transparency of all the work it's doing through its budget. So next slide. The Long Range Transportation Plan, as the TPO itself is something that's guided by both federal and state guidelines in terms of its creation. It's an expectation that it will be created and updated at least every 5 years, and it will cover a horizon of at least 20 years. So in this case, we're doing through 2050, so it's a 25-year, but the minimum is that it should be a 20-year horizon. And it looks at the identification of future needs, and the key piece of this is this fiscally constrained list of projects, or the cost feasible plan. And you'll hear a lot more about that. The anticipated adoption date is September 17th. That will be the TPO's board meeting in September. And all of what we're doing now and moving through is to prepare for that. And in fact, the item that you're reviewing today, the draft cost feasible plan, was most recently approved by the board for your review during this period of time, and to get your input and feedback as we move towards the ultimate adoption of this plan. Next slide, Mike. So this is just a brief overview of the steps that take place. Won't get into this in too much detail, but we'll talk a little bit more about needs assessment in a moment, and a project evaluation. But that brings us to that cost feasible plan and ultimately the adoption of the plan itself. There's a lot of upfront planning that goes on and kind of looking at a range of different types of plans and activities. So this whole pathway is taking place over a period of months, and then we're getting public input and stakeholder input all throughout the process. Next slide, Mike. One of those early planning steps is to establish the goals, and the goals for this plan are somewhat of a refinement of the current goals from the current long-range transportation plan. So looking ahead, there will be a little bit of change, but it really kind of affirms the basis of the current goals. And you can see here the breadth of what you're trying to look at with respect to a long-range plan like this. It is everything from ensuring that it's multimodal, that there's high user support in terms of connectivity of those modes. Economic development is an important consideration. In fact, as part of our stakeholder outreach, we've been communicating with both Flagler and Volusia County economic development partners. Safety is critical. Obviously, with transportation is a huge focus, and to that end, separately from this, kind of in parallel, the Vision Zero plan was recently, action plan was recently adopted by the board. So that's something else to look at, a very important step for the TPO. So this plan will kind of acknowledge and recognize that activity that's been done with the Vision Zero action plan. But livability and then public involvement are other key aspects of this. So kind of going to that next slide, Mike. For public involvement, just to give a little bit of background for this one plan, there's been a range of strategies that have included the fact that there's an LRTP specific web page, a lot of social media posts and information and sharing on different steps along the way, as well as some videos, one of which was promoting this very workshop today. And then the interactive input map that we'll talk about is another way in which we've been receiving input, and then a survey with that first one. We've held 4 prior virtual workshops, and those have been a way to kind of, in this format, share where we are in status. And then we had 3 in-person needs assessment public open houses, which I'll say a few more things about in just one moment. Extensive media stakeholder outreach through the communication of social media and other ways of getting the word out. And then, of course, importantly, the entire process of going through all the committee meetings and the board meetings through successive months of this and through all the steps, these are all publicly open meetings for times for public comments. So those are a key part of it as well. So next slide, Mike. So the 3 in-person public open houses were geographically dispersed to provide the opportunity for people to come to the different locations and to view the maps for the needs. And so at this point, this is a part of the step where there's a large volume of needs that have been identified for the region, and want to make sure that that's inclusive of the types of things that the public perceives and thinks are important to include. So these are a great forum for people to stand in front of the maps and kind of take a look at the information. We also had a computer with a public coordinate input map there, but these are great resources to have the opportunity to engage and hear from the public. But that's what we've also done in parallel, these virtual workshops, to get additional information for those who can't physically attend those meetings. So next slide. Been mentioning this public coordinate platform, and this is a view of what it was looking like for the needs assessment step. And what it allows people to do is zoom in and click on and then add comments in a specific area. We have typically found that people really like this ability, because sometimes just responding to a static PDF map and trying to write the description of what you're trying to explain is sometimes not as easy as when you can pinpoint a location and say, I'm curious about what's going on here. So Mike is going to be placing in the chat here the link to the public coordinate map that is available now for the next phase for this cost feasible plan, so that you can be looking at that as well. So collectively, between the workshops, the public coordinate map, we had 150 different comments provided through this platform. And it was a range of things related to some of the things that we would expect, obvious concerns about congestion, what possible roadways might have improved capacity through widening in the future, possibly even where there might be updated alignments. Looking also at operational improvements. How do you have existing corridors function better? People want to, they have comments regarding signal timing, those types of things. And then safety concerns across the board come up. That is something that, again, being heavily addressed through the Vision Zero action plan, and also being addressed here. And then just improved connectivity with the modes, making sure that the whole system thinks of the connectivity of bike and pedestrian facilities and trails, and also importantly, transit. How does transit interface? So these are the general essence of the types of comments that we've received on this plan so far. So Mike, you can go to the next slide. So been emphasizing, and want to echo what Colleen said on the front end, this is a multimodal plan. We're going to talk about the cost feasible plan, which is focused on the roadway component, but understand that that discussion focused on roadway does not mean we're not looking at these other modes that are part of the system. So bicycle and pedestrian and transit are very important. So Mike, if you can go to the next slide. In addition to the specific projects and the scale of those projects that are done through the cost feasible plan for roadway, there are pathways, in essence, for funding and providing for programming of bicycle and pedestrian projects. So the TPO receives what are called these SU or TMA. So TMA is short for Transportation Management Area. So any MPO or TPO that has an urbanized area with a population more than 200,000, so any of those throughout the country are the ones that receive these types of funds. So it's an additional type of funds that these more highly populated transportation planning areas receive. So the TPO has a policy that it's set aside 30% of that funding for bicycle and pedestrian and trail type projects. And so this will be something that to be thinking of in parallel to the work that's being done with the long range plan, because the intent is for projects to be identified and then annually set up as projects for this type of funding. These will draw from the annual list of priority projects. So that's why that one product I mentioned earlier is a very important step in the process, coming from the long range plan to the list of priority projects. And then importantly, the TPO is working very diligently, and really this is a region that's done an incredible job of establishing the regional trail network. Two major regional systems in this area from the state level, and then nationally there's East Coast Greenway, so a lot of effort focused on those types of projects. Mike, the next slide. So for transit, that same TMA money has a set aside for transit capital support. And so this is, again, the TPO putting the money in these multiple modes to make sure that they are receiving the type of funding beyond what are these larger projects that we'll talk about in the cost feasible plan. And so that's an important element. And one thing to think about is that all of the transit plans or transit agencies have their own transit development plans, or TDP. And so those happen also in parallel to these types of plans. And so they help shape what those priorities are. So this one does not have a lot of specifics to that, but we'll reference that with respect to these other transit plans. So just want to go to the next slide, Mike. And so we're going to turn now to the bigger focus of our discussion, and Mike's going to take over here in the next slide, but wanted to kind of share this, and any of you have seen this presentation, any of the long range plan work prior to this have seen this, but it really tries to show that there's the identification of a broader set of needs, then they go through a process of prioritization, and then ultimately they're constrained through this cost feasible plan that looks at what can be done in the future with the available revenues. So with that, and before we move on, I'll just pause briefly. Are there any questions about anything that's been presented so far before we get into the details of the cost feasible plan? Again, you can just raise your hand if you want to verbally ask, or send anything in the chat if you have any questions. Okay, well, Mike, if we're not seeing anything, then we'll proceed to you and go from there.
All right, great. Thank you, Jim. So Jim did a great job earlier on in the presentation, kind of describing the overall process of the long-range transportation plan, and on that preceding slide, kind of the main components of identifying what roadway projects will end up in the cost feasible plan that's in draft form, and we're looking for comments that we'll be sharing with you today, and that what's available at the link shared in the chat at the beginning of the meeting. So at the beginning of the process, we need to determine what are the needs to improve the transportation network and meet the demand that's anticipated through the year 2050. So with that, we aggregated projects from a variety of sources. So whether those projects were included in the 2045 LRTP that was adopted 5 years ago, the list of priority projects that was mentioned earlier, projects submitted by our local county and municipal government partners. And then part of the process also included looking at the future anticipated population and employment growth in both counties and where that growth is anticipated to occur, and using the available travel demand model to see other corridors that might be experiencing high levels of congestion through that year 2050. So that's kind of where we started. And then
Mike,
Jim, yeah,
just wanted to mention Omar has raised his hand.
sure.
Omar?
Yeah, thank you. My question is basically goes back to the introduction, and I would like to hear your thoughts on when is it a good time to introduce the performance-based long-range plan to a study like that, maybe in the future. So, what would be your recommendation on that?
Well, and I'll leave, if Colleen wants to add to this, she can add as well. But so Omar, it's a good question. In fact, because we're doing high level here, we're maybe not capturing all the detail. But one of the things that is an ongoing process of the TPO is a series of performance measures, federal performance measures that the TPO is constantly using as measures and targets. And then those are tied to products like this long-range plan, as well as the transportation improvement program. So this really comes out of a couple of the big federal bills over the last really decade and a half. And so all TPOs and MPOs are kind of on a level playing field in terms of having at least that baseline. And there can be additional, but that's some of that key performance-based planning linkage that happens. And so when, for example, in the long-range plan, we have the chapter talking about the goals and objectives, it also talks about the linkage to that, and then a system performance report looking at these respective measures for safety, reliability, system overall infrastructure. So I don't know, Colleen, do you have anything that you would add to that at all, or?
No, I think you covered it well.
Okay. So Omar, does that answer your question?
Yes, I do appreciate your input and your brief, but the question was for me whether this will become an integrated part of this plan or something that will be later on as an independent document, or how do you foresee that?
So for the performance measures, they are included within the plan. They're a process that happens. Again, they're pulled into the annual TIP, and they're going to be documented within the long range plan. So as those various measures come forward and the state sets targets, and then the TPO will evaluate those targets and determine whether they're going to adopt them. And so on a kind of recurring basis, this is something that's happening. So I guess in essence, there's not like one single place to always go with respect to performance, because it's so integrated in things that it's part of what gets reviewed and updated by the committees and board. Then it's part of the TIP, part of the long range plan. So you will see a section within this plan that will be the system performance report as an appendix to it that defines that.
That's a great explanation. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So Mike?
Sure, great. Thanks for the question, Omar. So again, just to briefly rewind. So again, the process of identifying projects that would be eventually considered for inclusion in the cost feasible plan started with the needs assessment. Like I was saying, some of this started with projects that were in previous planning initiatives. There's some technical analysis that went into the initial list of projects in the needs assessment. And then, like Jim mentioned, we brought those preliminary needs assessment lists and maps to the public through those open houses and that online map that we shared, again, to gather additional feedback. So once we had that kind of laundry list, so to speak, of all the roadway project needs within both counties, from there we went into the process of evaluating those against project evaluation criteria. And this criteria and the associated scoring was approved by TPO committees and the board. So again, essentially a primarily map-based process, but some of the criteria were also scored coming from different sources. But the needs projects went through this process to inform the prioritization of projects to be considered for the cost feasible plan, and then to end up with an overall score that can be could be referenced in the analysis of these projects, and also for reference of the TPO's committees and the board. And the categories and the criteria that were used were informed by the goals and objectives that Jim had shared on screen earlier. And the categories involved in that evaluation are shown here. They range from safety and congestion to environmental impacts, connectivity, whether bike ped elements would be advanced or included with certain projects. So again, this was a suite of criteria meant to advance, to consider projects against the goals of the plan. They ended up in a total score, and those were associated with the needs projects to help evaluate projects for consideration in the cost feasible plan. So from there, the next step is the development of the cost feasible plan. So the cost feasible plan, again, the draft is available for review throughout the rest of this month. And again, linked in the chat there at the beginning. These are roadway capacity projects that are derived from that needs assessment that we discussed that could be realistically funded through 2050. And we'll talk a little bit about the revenue estimates here, but every 5 years when LRTPs are required to be adopted again, FDOT provides each MPO and TPO in the state with a document that includes what revenues could be reasonably anticipated through 2050. And that's basically our starting point in developing the cost feasible plan when considering anticipated project costs against how much funding is expected to be available. So again, we talked about those criteria scores. So to kind of start the process, we looked at where these needs projects already sat in existing TPO planning documents, whether that's the listed priority projects or its status in the 2045 LRTP that was developed 5 years ago. And then to that point, prior project investments have projects already kind of moved along in their various phases. Has a project been funded through right away and it just needs construction funding applied to it to get it across the finish line. So considering those factors, our team obtained direction from the board to kind of look at projects through that lens, again, considering the available funding. And that's what you'll see when we share those lists with you here shortly. And then another thing I wanted to note was, like I mentioned, the needs assessment gave us a large list of projects. Obviously, with limited funding, not all of those can be deemed cost feasible, but all of those needs still will be documented in the LRTP. So those are captured for planning purposes, for planning consistency, because we want to make sure that this is a 5-year document, that all of those needs identified through this process are captured, even though they might not be financially viable at this time. So those will be included in the plan under categories unfunded needs. And then another thing I would note, along with some other project lists that will be included, Jim had mentioned bicycle pedestrian projects and transit. Along with these unfunded roadway needs, the LRTP will also include any anticipated developer-funded projects. So those are projects being funded via developer and kind of outside of the funding that's under the TPO's purview. But again, those are important projects that are critical to the overall network. So those would be included in the plan, along with projects submitted by our local agency partners that they anticipate funding through local funding sources. But again, not coming from the bucket of funding that we're working with, but again, projects that will be part of the network in over the planning horizon through 2050. So the first list of projects in the cost feasible plan that we wanted to talk about was the strategic intermodal system. So, are also known as SIS. The strategic intermodal system is FDOT's designated network of facilities throughout the state that are critical to economic activity, mobility, and freight movement. So within our planning area, that's I-4, I-95, State Road 40, and then portions of US 17 and State Road 100. Projects that are on the SIS cost feasible plan, rather, those are identified at the state level by FDOT, and we are essentially documenting those in an order of priority determined by the TPO board within the LRTP, but the funding being allocated to those projects is determined at the state level, and they're based on existing SIS planning documents. So that's the adopted second 5-year plan that covers 2030 through 2034. And then there's a SIS cost feasible plan published by FDOT that covers the years 2035 to 2050. So in the attachment, the PDF that is posted both on the TPO's website and linked there, there's a detailed table capturing what is included on the SIS cost feasible plan. And then I'd also note in the final long-range transportation plan documentation, Jim had mentioned earlier in the process, the TIP, that's essentially the first 5 years of the LRTP, that's fiscal year 2026 through 2030, and the TPO board just adopted that at the end of last month. There's going to be SIS projects that have funding in those first 5 years that will also be captured in the plan. So when we go through the list of projects on the following slides, you may be aware of a project that is actively in progress. You may not see it here because we're just covering from 2031 through 2050 in this presentation. So I did just want to note that. And again, the map shown on here on screen, that's included in your in the packet that was linked and the online map that we linked as well. So these are simplified versions of the table that's in the draft cost feasible plan that was shared with you, again, just for clarity. And these are, there's a number of them. So we, if you have any particular questions, we'll have some time for that, but I'll scroll through these. One thing I wanted to note, the first project there, LPGA Boulevard, and then the interchange at I-95. There is what were separate projects that are all now part of one project. That's the widening of LPGA from US 92 to Williamson. That includes the interchange at 95 and the replacement and the widening of the Tomoka River Bridge. So that's the footnote there. This table, again, just simplified version of what you have available to you. Quick description of the project improvement. And then the last column there are the phases that are funded between 2031 and 2050. So we'll move on to the next slide here. Of note on this slide is the I-4 project from essentially the Seminole County line to State Road 472. And these subsequent rows underneath are projects that are anticipated to be associated with that I-4 project, and as well as the widening of the St. Johns River Bridge. So we did want to note that. And then this is the last set of projects there on the SIS cost feasible plan. Again, there's a number of these that are just the PD&E study is funded in the horizon from 2031 to 2050. And we've also noted a truck parking study to be undertaken that goes from Brevard County, Indian River County line, all the way up to Flagler, St. Johns County line. So that's a study that we wanted to note there that's in that SIS documentation. Okay, so pivoting here back again to talk about the available revenues, because the suite of projects that we'll be talking about subsequently to this is basically the pool of funding that the cost feasible plan exercise was that we relied upon. This is funding that's specific to the TPO, again, based on the FDOT Revenue Forecast Handbook. And this is funding that can be applied to roadway capacity projects in the region. So there's a bucket of funding for, and you'll see in the following list, they're organized this way. There's a bucket of funding for roadway projects on the state highway system that is not on that SIS network that I described. There's a funding category for what's called other roads. So those are projects that are not on the SIS and not on the state highway system. Sometimes they're called off system, but those are county or municipal roadways that are eligible for this type of funding. And then there is the last row there. That is a bucket of what is called district-wide funding that's applicable to anywhere within District 5. All the MPOs and TPOs collaborated through their forum, the Central Florida MPO Alliance, and determined what portion of that funding each MPO could use for their planning purposes and development of the LRTP. And again, here you have two columns. The first is showing year of expenditure dollars. So that's the value of that money over the various planning periods. So 2031 to 2035, 36 to 2040, and then 2041 to 2050. And then the column all the way on the right is the present day value. So that's the value of those dollars in 2025 figures. What you'll be seeing in your the attachment of the draft cost feasible plan that we linked, all of that funding is shown in year of expenditure. That's again to have a better picture of what those projects will cost by the time we get to those phases, and that's also a requirement of the LRTP to show the funding and project cost in year of expenditure. So we'll jump here to the draft cost feasible plan that's on that state highway system, non-SIS, and then those other roads that we described. Again, this is in your packet. Again, these are major non-SIS corridors that are on the state highway system, and then those roads that are not on the SIS or not state highway system. Those are shown on the map here, also included in your packet. And then another thing that we'll note, and this is a carryover from the 2045 LRTP and at the direction of the TPO board, that $20 million essentially off the top of those funds that I showed you on the previous slide would be allocated to what the TPO is called local initiative projects. This is additional funding that the TPO would put on state highway system projects through 2050, and that's to support and advance things like complete streets projects, roundabouts, advanced technology, and then other improvements that are aligned with the plan's goals. So you'll see that there's essentially a line item for that on the draft CFP that is out there for review. So we just wanted to note that doesn't show up on the map, but that funding is accounted for. So this is the list of the draft cost feasible state highway system non-SIS projects. And it begins here with Clyde Morris Boulevard from Belleville to US 92. Initially, this project was a winding project, but now it's more of what was called an urban corridor improvement, more of a complete streets type treatment. We're showing, so that phases funded column, that shows what's determined to be cost feasible through 2050. So when you see cost feasible in that last column, that shows that we were able to put funding all the way through construction through 2050. And then again, the table that has been provided to you, there's more details that kind of shows where in those various time bands that money is applied. But again, just a kind of simple summary here showing that, showing the phases that would be funded through 2050. Then there's two projects here, as a budgeting exercise. So after we were able to show those first four projects with construction as cost feasible, there's funding available to get these next two projects kind of further down the line, showing right-of-way funding within that 20 years. And that's why we've noted them as partially cost feasible. And then those local initiatives that I noted on the previous slide, those are shown there as well. So again, these are projects on the state highway system, but not on that SIS network. Then the next slide, these are our other roads. These are non-SIS, non-state highway. And again, similar to what I shared in the previous slide, we're showing here the phases that are determined to be cost feasible as part of our process through 2050. And then again, we have a project, the Tomoka Farms Road from 44 to Taylor Road, with funding being available in our exercise to show PD&E study and design within that 20-year period. And so we're showing that as partially cost feasible. So with that, kind of wanted to open it up to some questions from the group. There's 4 questions on the screen here. Feel compelled to answer any of these or a combination. But again, these are up on screen to kind of begin the discussion and kind of get you thinking about any input that you may have on this list of projects that we just shared. And again, these are in that PDF that was linked at the beginning of the workshop as well. So you can put a question in the chat. You can raise your hand to ask out loud. And again, like Jen mentioned at the beginning of the workshop, this meeting is being recorded and then will be published on the TPO's website for people that weren't able to join, or that they can view and listen to at their convenience. So I just wanted to note that again before we open it up for questions. Okay, we do have a question in the chat. So Heather, yes. So well, yes. The simple answer is yes. That this document will be made publicly available. The draft cost feasible plan is available for public review right now through August 1st. And then, there may be some refinements made based on that public input and then input from the TPO committees and boards in August, and then adopted and published publicly in September. I would also note too that as far as it relates to city planning staff, the TPO does have a technical coordinating committee, and that's made up of representatives of the counties and cities within the TPO's planning area. So there's been city it ranges on who's on the committee, but engineering and planning staff is represented from local agencies on those TPO committees. So they have been involved in seeing this throughout the process as well. And then again, this will be a public document, so the development community would obviously be able to access this as well. All right. Well, you're welcome, Heather. Any other questions? And like Jim noted at the beginning, the draft cost feasible plan portion is available for public comment through August 1st. So if you have questions about what you saw today or that you think about later, and we'll share that again here on screen, but you can submit those via email or on the input map we'll share here shortly as well. Okay, so Richard, great question. So I'll speak to this, and I know that we were not involved directly in the Vision Zero action plan, but we can talk to it a little bit, and then Colleen, feel free to chime in. But the Vision Zero action plan was kind of occurring concurrently with our work on the LRTP. And in fact, that prioritization criteria that we described earlier as it related to the safety was derivative of work that Vision Zero Action Plan team had done. So when we were looking at these needs projects, we were looking at were these potential roadway projects on the high injury network as determined through the Vision Zero Action Plan process? What were the safety scores that were assigned to those segments in those corridors throughout that? So safety has been a primary focus throughout, and then that will obviously be noted in the plan. We will be referencing the Vision Zero Action Plan and noting some of the recommendations that have come out of that and referencing that effort. So that's kind of how they interacted. So we were fortunate in the sense they were kind of happening at the same time, and we were able to partner, at very least in leveraging some of that data that they had collected. So hopefully that answers your question, Richard. All right. Okay, so with that, and again, like I mentioned, feel free to chime in with any questions after the fact via emailing the TPO. There's a comment form on the TPO's website. And then on the next slide here, Jim mentioned it earlier, was the public coordinate map that was launched during the needs assessment phase. And then we linked it again in the chat, but this has been repurposed. That includes the draft cost feasible plan online. So this map will be available for you to comment. So you can zoom in and out of this map, and you can use this button off to the right to place comments on the map. And then the draft cost feasible plan PDF is also linked here on this button at top. And so again, through August 1st, you can also place and submit comments here in map-based form as well. And then, Richard, I think I saw your follow-up there. Yes, and then Colleen could speak to that too, but yes, the TPO does advance safety projects through some of that annually allocated funding.
Yeah, and just to follow up, Richard, appreciate your comment here. The 20 million that we talked about earlier during this presentation is a set aside for what we kind of call local initiatives, but a complete streets type project could fall within that category, so we can use some of that funding. But in addition, we also have funding for our bike ped program, where we set aside 30% of our TMA allocation, which through the course of the plan is about, I believe it's about $155 million. So 35% of that over the 20 years, would go specifically to bike ped improvements. And then with regards to the Vision Zero Action Plan, any project that's been identified within that plan then is eligible for local governments to also submit to the federal government for project implementation. So there's other funding sources outside of the TPO that could also advance some of the projects in that particular plan.
Great, thanks, Colleen. No, that. So we shared the link to the map. Again, this will be available through August 1st for you to place comments. And additionally, if there's again another opportunity here to raise your hand, ask a question, or pose a comment, you can email comments to the email address there on screen. There's the link to the dedicated page for the 2050 LRTP on the TPO's website. And then again, the map that I had shared on the previous screen, that's been linked in the chat. And there's also a link on the TPO website as well. And again, we're just asking that provide any comments on the draft cost feasible list of projects prior to August 1st. Okay. So with that, we will say thank you. And again, here's the link to that page on the TPO's website. This is where you can stay up to date on upcoming activities. Again, we're getting close to the adoption here in a couple months, but you can also view other documentation that's preliminary documentation that's been produced and provided during earlier phases of the project. So that's available there for you to take a look at as well. But again, our primary ask during this month is that feedback on those listed projects that we shared this afternoon. And that'll help us in the final stages of the planning process and get the LRTP adopted in September. Well, we appreciate your time. Any final words, Colleen? I'll defer to you.
Yeah, again, I just want to thank you as well. I know there's a lot of information within this presentation as well as in the tables that are provided for the cost feasible. So if there's ever any questions that you have as you're looking through them, after this workshop, please feel free to reach out to TPO staff and we can, talk through what the projects mean or what, certain phases are, and then provide some information back to you. So again, thank you for your time today and hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.